Coming up next, we have Emily Tan, General Manager at Shell's Global City Solutions business, which is part of their Renewables and Energy Solutions arm. We're very happy to have Emily here today to help discuss mobility for sustainable cities and how Shell is playing a role in helping cities with their energy transition plans. Well, Emily, welcome again and thank you for joining us in the studio. Well, Emily, of course, we're here to talk about mobility for sustainable cities, and the word city is in your title under Global City Solutions. This may seem like an obvious question, but tell us, why are cities so important, and how does mobility play a role in spearheading sustainability there?
Right, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Good afternoon to everyone. Mobility for sustainable cities is a topic that's very close to my heart. Why are cities important? Today, 55% of the world's population live in cities. And cities already consume more than 2/3 of the world's energy and emit over 70% of our carbon emissions. The UN forecasts that 70% of the world's population will live in cities by 2050. So we can imagine the strain and the demands on energy, as well as the carbon emitted from cities, will become very important for us to mitigate if we are to meet our climate ambition goals. And how does mobility play? We've done extensive studies of over 500 cities to understand how they develop. And there are basically 5 fundamental areas that we need to look into for sustainable cities. These are the areas of mobility, energy, environment, urban planning, and living. And each of these elements also interact as we look at integrated solutions. Mobility plays a very key role because today, transport sector contributes to about 1/4 of the carbon emissions from fuel combustion. So imagine as more and more people live in cities, the demands on transportation becomes higher, and therefore the emissions will become even greater.
Well, those are some very sobering statistics there, isn't it? 1/4 of the emissions come from fuel.
Yes.
And of course, the majority of our pollution today comes from cities, and that's only set to worsen. Well, tell us, everybody knows in our mind that we need to move towards a cleaner future, but there seems to be a lot of resistance to that. What are some of your key challenges in implementing mobility for sustainable cities?
When I think about mobility for sustainable cities, it goes beyond just moving people and goods. It's also about looking at reducing emissions through lower carbon fuels. It's also giving people access through convenient and efficient means, and also tapping on technology to make journeys safer and giving people more informed choices and diverse choices to make in terms of how they move around. Let's first tackle lower carbon mobility. It's quite easy to think that I can just convert to EVs by buying an EV, but it isn't so simple. Because when I talk to the ecosystem players, they tell me, consumers like you and I, we can't buy an EV because there are no models being brought in, or not the right models being brought in by the dealerships. And we are afraid of not being able to charge our cars because there's not enough EV chargers around. But when you talk to the dealers, they say that, well, they're not bringing in the models because there's no demand.
Chicken and egg.
Chicken and egg, exactly. And when you talk to the EV charging service companies, there's no EVs, so why would I put in the chargers, right? So you really have that chicken and egg situation, and you have to break that cycle. So collaboration becomes extremely key when we look at implementing such system-level changes to enable that move towards a lower carbon future. Let me also give the example of hydrogen, which is another low carbon fuel that's very promising. Hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles can be charged in a few minutes, and there's no greenhouse gas emissions from the tailpipe. In fact, the emission is water vapor. So, and if the hydrogen comes from green sources, then you really have a net zero emissions car, right? But to implement the change to go towards hydrogen as a cleaner fuel, you need to look at the supply and the demand, how to transport the hydrogen fuel, where do you put in hydrogen filling stations, and also work with the car manufacturers to bring in the right vehicles for the right use. So collaboration is extremely key. And Shell has worked on forming such collaborations in certain parts of the world. So on hydrogen, which is really a long-term view, we have formed partnerships as part of H2 Accelerate in Europe, where we team up with the likes of truck makers like Daimler and Volvo, as well as other like-minded corporates, to synchronize the investments into this area such that we can enable the mass adoption of hydrogen-fueled vehicles for the future. We've also done a collaboration with the California Energy Commission to build up to 50 hydrogen refuel stations with the support of car manufacturers, again, like Toyota and Honda. So such collaboration bringing everyone to the table and working together is going to be very important. And it's a key challenge. It's not easy, but it's very important to enable such lower carbon mobility choices.
So you spoke, indeed, it's a complex issue and very much chicken and egg, who moves first? So how do you decide when to bring in the government players first or when to bring in the private sector partners along the supply chain? Walk us through your thought process and how you convince them to be perhaps the first to start the ball rolling.
Yeah, so maybe to explain how we do it, let me just give a little bit of context of why we're doing this as well. So Shell has announced that we want to be a net zero emissions energy company by 2050, in step with society and in step with our customers. We've been investing into lower carbon fuel options like biofuels, hydrogen, or EV charging, as well as electricity generated from renewable sources such as solar and wind. So we want to decarbonize together with our customers, and we're looking at helping them on the decarbonization journeys in sectors that are traditionally difficult to decarbonize. So since a long time ago, we identified that cities play a very key role in decarbonization for the reasons that I told you earlier on, right? And so because of that, we then set up Shell City Solutions, which is the business that I'm responsible for globally, to help cities navigate energy transition through integrated urban solutions. So the approach is indeed very collaborative. We approach a broad spectrum of city stakeholders, including the government, the private sector, and the community, to come and brainstorm and think about how do we go towards this decarbonization journey. For example, in 2019, we collaborated with the OECD and Leonard, which is a think tank set up by the Vinci Group, to pull together 45 different key stakeholders in Paris with government stakeholders, private sector, as well as think tanks. And together we brainstorm about how do we help Paris achieve its climate action plan, which is to become carbon neutral by 2050. The output of this session was to create scenarios which charted 3 different pathways of how success could look like in the future. And this helps us to set our thinking about what are the areas we then need to focus on and really implement as the next step. And then after getting together the various stakeholders and understanding what their needs are, we then need to look for solutions that can then implement this and move forward towards a lower carbon future. And so Shell is continuously investing into promising technologies. In the space of EV charging, for example, we invested into Green Lots in the US, which also has an increasing presence in Singapore in terms of providing EV charging networks. We invested into New Motion in Europe. And most recently, just I think last month, we invested into Ubitricity, which is a company that works with local governments to tap on existing infrastructure like street lamps that can put EV charging at the street lamps. So literally, we're enabling the man in the street to charge his car at the street.
Ubiquitously, hence the name.
Yeah, that's right. And beyond just investing or acquiring companies, we also have a VC arm that works with startups. And we're investing into promising digital technologies like Masabi, which enables an app for us to choose the best public transport or mode of intermodal transportation. It makes it easier for people to navigate and easy to use. Beyond that, we're also incubating our own companies. So we have our own incubated company called Connected Freight in Singapore, recognizing the increasing importance of freight transportation as people move a lot more towards online. There's more and more goods being moved about, perhaps than people. We need to optimize how these freight journeys are being made. And so we incubated that company as well.
And make those freight journeys greener as well.
Greener, more efficient, using less trucks, full trucks, right? Right now, there are many trucks that are half full, which is very efficient.
Fewer journeys to be made with maximum load.
Absolutely. Indeed.
Interesting. So it sounds like what you really do at Shell City Solutions, it's almost an end-to-end. You bring the city stakeholders together.
That's right.
You ideate together, but you don't leave them dangling. Then you curate a whole network of potential solutioning partners to then offer those as solutions.
Yeah. That's right. One recent example I can cite is also last week, I'm not sure if you would have seen the announcement. We announced together with our partner, the Energy Market Authority, that we've awarded a grant to a local company called Eigen to implement a smart energy management system at 3 of our retail sites. So soon we'll be able to offer solar to battery to fast charging for our customers at 3 of our sites. And this collaboration is a good example of how an industry player like ourselves can collaborate with the government as well as local industry partners. First of all, to implement renewable and sustainable solutions, and also at the same time upgrade the capabilities of our local industry.
Now, you did mention that Paris model with the Vinci Group as well as OECD. Do you have plans to replicate that model successfully here in Asia as well?
Oh, absolutely. So Singapore is one of our key cities. So we set up a City Solutions Living Lab back in 2019, specifically to work with various different stakeholders and implement innovative solutions that we then hope to replicate globally. And we're also looking at many different cities in Europe and US as well.
Share a bit more of those plans if they're not too sensitive.
Well, the idea is that you need to have collaboration to make things happen. And City Solutions, we are setting up collaborative partnerships with various city stakeholders in key targeted cities. And the key thing is that we need the cities to be committed to be on this journey with us to lower carbon. And we also want to be able to effect the solutions that can help move the needle. And with that, we're also constantly looking for partners to be with us on this journey. So cities like Singapore, like Houston, Paris are key cities that we're working on, and we're going to be including on many more cities in the pipeline.
Sounds like we should be keeping our eyes peeled for some Shell press releases coming out soon. Now, I wanted to go back to the broader theme of sustainable cities. Now, as cities, because there's so much pollution and so much inefficiencies going on, there's also much work to be done. What do you see to be key priorities, almost in stages or phases, in moving towards sustainability? Or does it really depend on the cities themselves as well?
It does depend on the cities. So every single city is unique, right? There's sort of no one-stop solution that can cater to every single city. And different cities have different stress points as well. I talked about the 5 fundamental areas. So mobility, energy, environment, urban planning and living. Those are 5 fundamental areas that we need to look at for sustainable cities. For City Solutions, we focus on the first 3, mobility, energy, and environment, because that's where Shell has a wealth of experience and where we feel we can really contribute towards mitigating the carbon footprint. So key areas, mobility we talked about, very, very key. Energy is another area, because as mentioned, cities consume a lot of energy, and as they grow, they will even demand more. How do we move it towards more renewable and sustainable solutions? How do we increase energy efficiency? And how do we look at solutions that are more systems level versus individual push, which is very, very little small increments?
That's right, negligible nudges if it's individual rather than systems.
Correct.
So I'm curious, earlier you said city-to-city approach. So obviously what's going to work in Singapore is very different from Indonesia, which is getting very urbanized nowadays. Let's take Jakarta, for example. How would you apply Shell's Living Lab approach to the first 3 thrusts that you mentioned, mobility, environment, and energy?
So Jakarta will have different city stresses as Singapore, but that doesn't mean that we can't replicate the successes of Singapore to Jakarta with a certain level of tweak, right? So Jakarta, we know, is highly congested. Traffic is always an issue. So mobility is certainly a big opportunity to work on in Jakarta. How do we ensure that the journeys can become less carbon intensive? How do we make it much more efficient for people? And especially as the city is becoming more and more congested, right? So looking at other fuel options would be one to look into. Looking at optimization using digital tools would be another. How do we help customers on their journey to better plan, better utilize a mix of public transportation with private transportation? And how do they minimize their carbon footprint along the way? Well, some of the areas that potentially can be looked at.
I think for sure the Jakarta commuters would jump at the mobility optimization bit. But what about cost? You know, when you're telling people to switch towards something cleaner, but that might cost a bit more or quite a bit more in the short term, how do you make that happen? Especially if, for example, sometimes government support might take a while to catch up.
Yeah, so again, I go back sort of to collaboration. It has to be that collaboration between the government, the private sector, as well as the community. So I think consumer behaviors are also moving. Slowly but surely, I think the general public is getting more and more aware of the impact that they are having on the environment with their own carbon footprint. Studies show that I think 60% of the young people actually are conscious about it and want to move towards lower carbon solutions. So there is that push and that drive to say, okay, I do want to monitor this. So would they be willing to pay more? Perhaps to a certain extent. But we also need to make it convenient and easy for them to make those choices. And therefore, I talk about system level changes. How do we ensure or enable more lower carbon fuels to be adopted in a congested city? And how do we make public transportation a good alternative together with private? How do you ensure a mix of both public and private transportation options for the consumers? And how do you make it easy for them to choose? So I talk about using technologies, knowledge in their hands, what is the best, what is the most convenient use of their journeys.
What makes the most practical sense for them at
Absolutely.
the end of the day.
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, three big partners, city stakeholders, the government, private sector, as well as local communities. And any one of them could initiate that push, much like the more conscious grown-up consumers in Indonesia
Indeed.
today. Well, let's get to a question from Christopher in the audience. He says, hi, you mentioned up to 50 hydrogen stations here. When will they be up?
It's a phased approach. So we will start with 8 of them. And then as we work with the partners, we will increase it increasingly to California. So California is a state that is very forward-looking in terms of wanting to reduce their carbon footprint.
So that's more for the US then? If
But
it's
this one is the
California.
US, yes,
Okay.
California.
I think this is Christopher Tan. I'm not sure if he's in the US or in Singapore, but he
Right.
might have thought that, oh, wow, Singapore is going to have hydrogen stations. What
Not
will
so
it
soon.
take? Yeah, what would it take for Singapore to have our own
I think
hydrogen
the
stations?
Singapore government has been very interested in hydrogen as well. So I don't want to put words in their mouth, but last year they did do a study on hydrogen to understand what are some of the levers they could pull in terms of hydrogen. Hydrogen is a dense energy carrier. So it is an effective carrier also to be able to transport renewable energy. So that's why Shell has invested a lot into hydrogen research. We're investing into the production of hydrogen, the transportation of hydrogen, and also the use of hydrogen in transport, in both road transport as well as other means like marine transport as well. And to enable that to happen, again, I talk about system level change, right? So you need to think about, can we generate hydrogen from renewable sources, therefore making green hydrogen? How do we transport it safely, effectively, and cost efficiently, which is very, very important. So we're currently doing a trial with some partners in Japan to also look at that long journeys of hydrogen. And then, of course, with the city stakeholders to understand how do we implement transportation options for hydrogen. Singapore is interested to look at hydrogen as an alternative low carbon fuel. And we are also working with our city stakeholders to understand how do we start planning this journey. It's going to be a long-term journey, but it's a journey that we should start today.
Right, and of course in Singapore budget recently, the whole focus was on EVs and hitting that target by 2040. Well, that sounds like an excellent example of a systems approach
Yes.
to getting us towards the step when people overcome battery anxiety, charging, as well as getting the manufacturers on board as well.
That's right, yeah. So I'm very encouraged by the Singapore Green Plan. I think it's an excellent plan. And I'm very encouraged by the government announcing aggressive plans to increase charging points and making it more attractive for you and I to buy EVs and actually go on this journey of electrification.
Well, for people that are still a little bit reticent, since there are 3 big city stakeholder partners, local communities being one, what would be kind of a call to action to everyone that might still be a bit reluctant to get onto this journey, right, towards a sustainable city or sustainable lifestyle?
I would say that you're not alone on this journey. It is a collective effort. We must work together and to achieve that lower carbon future. It is going to impact every single one of us, as we've seen with recent events. And you can see that increasingly all the governments, city stakeholders, and industry are coming together to announce net zero ambitions. You can see that move coming. And I think we need every single individual to do their part. So you're not alone on that journey. So in fact, we should really jump on the bandwagon and join the team on this low carbon.
And I suppose we are a bit fortunate in Singapore. We have some tax rebates and incentives.
Yes, indeed. Hope more to come, right?
to sweeten the deal a little bit
Absolutely.
more. Now, for people that are not quite ready to adopt an EV yet or make very drastic changes to their lifestyle, because I understand everybody's lifestyle contributes to having a sustainable city at the end of the day. What is something that businesses as well as individuals can start doing? Maybe baby steps almost.
Baby steps for individuals.
And businesses.
And businesses. Well, for businesses like Shell, we have announced our net zero ambition. And we are actively looking at our own operations and how we can reduce emissions on our own operations. We're actively looking at transforming our operations as well, our businesses, to be able to reduce our own emissions from operations, but also helping our customers to decarbonize their journeys. So even at our retail stations where you go and pump fuel, we're offering carbon-free drives. So you can get carbon credits, which don't cost a lot at all, cost very little. That makes your drive a carbon-free drive. So there are little things that consumers can already do. And in fact, well, this is a good example where, because Shell is able to offer this carbon-free drive, it makes it easier for our consumers to say, okay, I'm willing to pay a few cents more to make it carbon neutral. And that's that collaboration that needs to really happen.
And it's
among
those little nudges that add up to something at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
And that's a benefit Shell has because you already have that customer-facing reach
That's right.
across countries.
Indeed, we know mobility. We've been in this business for over 100 years, so we know drivers, we know cars, and that's why we really want to be at the forefront of this.
And it's lovely to see how you're harnessing all of that knowledge over the past 100 years to transition us into a cleaner
transforming
future.
ourselves and also transitioning with our customers.
That's right. Thank you so much with that. I really want to thank you, Emily, for taking time to walk us through all of that. And I look forward to seeing those 5 steps happen in Singapore, the region, and the world.
Thank you. Look forward to it.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.